Welcome. Good morning for those in North America, and good afternoon, good evening for those in Europe and elsewhere. It's so great to see everyone. I think given it's already 9 o'clock, let's just get going. For everyone, this is Hugo, who's meant to be napping at the moment, but decided he was much more interested in hearing about mortality data. So today we're very excited to have Ariel Karlinsky talking about the World Mortality Dataset. Ariel is an economics PhD student at Hebrew University. Thanks so much for agreeing to talk about this exciting work. It's got a lot of press coverage and been a lot of involved in a lot of different projects, so I'm super excited to hear about it today. So take it away, Ariel. Thanks.
Cool. Everybody can hear me all right? Give me a thumbs up, something. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk for about, Monica told me I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. Then we're going to have like about 15 minutes, 20 minutes of discussion. If something's unclear, you are more than welcome, I think, to interrupt me in the middle. No, there's no quiz or test at the end. So it's better that, everything will be clear than that I get to, everything I have to present. If someone can pinpoint me when we have like 2 minutes until the end, if I'm stuck on something, for example. But other than that, I'm just gonna go ahead. I'm very happy to be here. I've been in several of these meetings after they were recorded because of the time differences, but hopefully now it won't be such an issue. So the work I'm presenting is the World Mortality Dataset. It's joint work with Dmitry Kolbek from the University of Tübingen. Like Monica said, I'm from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Israel, and I'm also a member of the WHO Technical Advisory Group on COVID-19 Mortality Assessment. And again, the work is the World Mortality Dataset. So I'm going to talk about all-cause mortality data, which is it's a strange way to phrase it for a demography group because you know about all-cause mortality data, but I'm an economist and I usually present to economists and to epidemiologists. And I think it's important to set the historical stage and context for why we even need all-cause mortality data. Then I'm going to talk about this work. I'm going to talk about excess mortality and the relation to COVID-19. And perhaps I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the updates and challenges since we officially published this after a peer review in, I think, June 2021. Okay, so why do we even need mortality data, right? When I started working on this, a lot of people told me, I don't understand why you're working so hard to get all this information from all these countries. I can easily just go to the Johns Hopkins dashboard or to WHO COVID dashboard and see on a daily basis how many COVID cases and deaths each country has. So why do you even need this? And the answer is, of course, that the entire discourse on, false positives, he died with, not from, is it as bad or worse than, the Black Plague or the Spanish flu or all of these historical calamities, it's completely irrelevant because it is, I like to term this first world problems, right? So the entire, nowhere had first world technology 50 to 100 years ago. And the way that we know, or rather estimate, the toll of previous pandemics, natural disasters, wars, genocides, etc., is with excess mortality. So there was no RCT testing, right, for the Spanish flu. So how do we even know how many people died in the Spanish flu or the London plague of 1665? We know it by using excess mortality. I'm going to define it a bit more formally because it's a formal demography working group. But excess mortality is the difference between observed mortality and expected mortality. And expected mortality is what you would expect in the absence of the event that you think might be triggering excess mortality. So this is an example from a paper by some economic historians, which I really like. The entire paper is about something else entirely. It's about the effect of Nazi marches on mobilization of voting in Germany prior to World War II. And they use excess deaths during the Spanish flu as an instrument for population density, because the denser you are, the more disease you have. And they show with, fantastic weekly data from the city of Hamburg in Germany, North Germany, that you can see here in 1918, during the Spanish flu, that mortality was much higher than the year prior and the year after that. Right? So this is essentially excess mortality, this difference here. So mortality used to be about 500 people a week. It peaked to about 1.5 thousand, yes. So 3 times as higher. And there's another example. This is a paper from Schiller, I think, from Significance, from the journal Significance. It's from the Worshipful Company of Parish Clerks. It's one of the guilds of the city of London, and they have these Books of the Dead. It's a great name for a metal band. But every week they would compile these ledgers of all the people who died in the city, including causes of death. Some of them are really interesting, like someone died from a boulder falling on them. Someone died because a candle lit his mattress on fire. But also there was a plague going on, and you can see here that they even tried to, ascertain the number of people who died in the plague, which is more than 7,000. But actually, what our estimates for the number of people who died in this particular plague is the total number of people who died throughout this week, which is 8,300, compared to the number of people who should have died or would have died in the absence of it, expected mortality, which was about 1,000. So mortality was about 8 times higher than what you would expect, which of course, that's excess mortality. So excess mortality is not a new concept. I don't know about you, I was exposed to it completely. It's completely new to me. I used to be much more of a labor economist, so I did a bit of health economics, but not a lot of it. I knew excess mortality through The Economist, for the Financial Times, but it's essentially a very old school method. Okay, so to do excess mortality estimates, we need mortality data. And when I started working on this, when I got interested in this topic, I did what economists do a lot, which is you go to these international repositories of data, because they did all the hard work for me in a sense, and I'm gonna just collect it and analyze it myself. So I usually go to the World Bank, I go to the OECD, to the UN, to the WHO. But I found out that they only collect release estimates annually, and these are usually delayed by a few years, right? So even demographers, I think, are not entirely interested in what's happening in a particular year. I'm not sure if I'm a demographer or not by now, but we're more interested in sort of like long-term trends. And it doesn't really matter if in 2020 you're going to analyze latest data in 2018. But in March 2020, it was, of course, very obvious that you need much more almost real-time data. So you need more high-frequency data. There's a great paper by Simonsen et al. About the Spanish flu that says, actually, to get a better gauge of the Spanish flu, you need weekly or monthly data. And what you had, of course, in 1918 was at best something annual. So you need like daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, anything that is, more granular than annual. So what did exist? Fortunately, a lot of international organizations, a lot of national stats offices really understood the importance of tracking all-cause mortality data. So it started, I think, with the Eurostat from the European Union and also some other states, not necessarily European Union member states. Eurostat essentially asked them voluntarily to please submit weekly all-cause mortality data, also broken down by age and sex if possible, from the earliest year available, so from, I think, the year 2000 up to now. And they started doing this, I think, back in May 2020. There's the Great Short-Term Mortality Fluctuations dataset from mortality.org, which is MPIDR and UC Berkeley, has a lot of overlap with Eurostat, but it also includes some non-European countries, such as Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. There's also Euromomo, which I'm very critical of, and I'm not going to talk about, but essentially the same data as Eurostat, but it's opaque, so you can't really use the data yourself. And like I said earlier, the way I was exposed to this topic is through media efforts from the Financial Times, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and most of them really relied on Eurostat and SDMF, which is what they had. Very little coverage of low to mid-income countries and non-European countries. That's what we had when we started working on this. It's not that the data doesn't exist. It does exist, but it's hidden in plain sight. So it's in quarterly reports, in table generators, in automatic press releases from various national statistics offices, population registries, ministries of health, ministries of public health. In each country, it will be a slightly different institution, but the data does exist. So in that sense, it's not a huge undertaking in the sense I didn't go to, graveyards and started counting graves. So this is something that is done, especially in very low income countries or in countries where the official institutions are very opaque. So this is sort of what the data looks like. These are 4 examples, just to give you an outline. So on the top left here, you have Azerbaijan, you have monthly data, deaths data 2019, 2020, and you can see the large increase in 2020. A lot of this is, of course, the Nagorno-Karabakh War, which is another project that I have with the great Ursula Turisi. This is data from Egypt, monthly data 2020, 2021. This is Arabic numerals, so it might be a bit hard to understand, but it also shows that 2021 was even higher than 2020. We're going to see it in a few minutes. This is Japan, in blue 2019, in red 2020. And you can see that it looks like 2020 is about totally in line with 2019, which is essentially what we see. And indeed, in Japan, there was little to no excess mortality in 2020, most of 2021. And on the bottom right here, you have Serbia, this is deaths, this is births. I think you're all aware that a lot of Eastern Europe and Serbia as well have a negative natural increase. So higher deaths than births, this is the standard situation prior to pandemic, but you can also see that in 2020, especially in July, and then starting from October, deaths were much higher than they were in 2019. So that's where we come in. Me and Dmitry, we collected data and analyzed data in our single repository we call the World Mortality Dataset. Contains weekly and monthly all-cause mortality data from 2015 to 2022. Different countries have different, latest date of data. So Peru, for example, I think has the most up-to-date data because they release daily data, which I collect 2 to 3 times a week. El Salvador only have data up to August 2020 for not very demographic reasons, we'll say. So the time varies, but it's mostly from 2015 to 2022. We have 122 countries and territories. We're currently the largest open data set of its kind, constantly maintained and updated. I just pushed an update yesterday, which is what I'm going to show you. Everything clear until now? Someone wants to ask something? Okay. So this is our coverage map. So each country in blue is a country that we have. Like I said earlier, you can see here most of Eurostat and SDMF, which is Western Europe, North America. We also have pretty much all of Latin America. The big exceptions here are Haiti, Venezuela, and Honduras. We have most of the former Soviet Union. We especially lack data, as you can see, in Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Now, there are countries here, learning from this topic, there are countries here where I do expect data to be available sometime soon, or it is already available, but it's not shared, such as in Turkey or in Saudi Arabia or China. There are countries, especially in Africa, where I know that vital registration is essentially non-existent or very weak. So I don't expect data to pretty much almost never be available. Our best estimate so far, I think, of excess mortality from these countries rely on much more ground level work, like I said, with graveyards, satellite imagery, a lot of really interesting and much more creative work than what I'm doing, which is essentially just counting the number of deaths. Okay, so that's what I said about the sources. So we hand collected the data from relevant institutions And if we weren't able to find ourselves, we contacted the institutions. Many did not even reply. We tried multiple times. Many replied that they don't have the data, such as in Africa, and some were very, very helpful. So Mongolia's National Stats Office has an amazing table generator. I wish the Israeli National Stats Office had such a great table generator. It doesn't. The work was published, I'm blanking out if it's June or August in eLife. It has been available online since January 2021, I think. And we are the source, together with the STMS and others, of all-cause mortality data and access estimates for our world in data. So you can see the little, caption there, source World Mortality Dataset, the World Health Organization, The Economist, the Financial Times, and I'm sure that many, many, many more that I'm just not aware of because, as you know, citing data is often not done, unfortunately. Okay, let's have a look at our data. Even before we're gonna do any modeling, I think it's really important to just look at raw data, see what you have, because as we saw in the example of Hamburg, excess mortality is essentially the difference between observed mortality and what you would expect. And what you would expect is based on what you've seen sort of in the past. So this here is mortality from all our 122 countries and territories. From 2015 to 2019, it's either weekly or monthly, right? So each line is a year. And you can see here what every demographer or epidemiologist should know who deals with mortality. You mainly see here within year seasonality, right? So if we go here to the US is it's in the northern hemisphere, much like most of Europe. So deaths are higher in the winter, which is in the start and the end of the year, and lower in the spring. If you go to Argentina, which is in the southern hemisphere, it's exactly the other way around. There are also some countries which are close to the equator, such as Peru or Singapore, where there's not much seasonality in death. So spring, winter, death behaves mostly the same. What I'm gonna do right now is I'm just gonna superimpose 2020 deaths on top of this chart. So it's hard to figure out what to concentrate on. So let's concentrate on the US because I think maybe most of the people here are from the US. So this is the US. I'm gonna superimpose 2020. This is what 2020 deaths look like. And you can see that at the beginning of 2020, so before COVID hit, right? So January, February 2020, you can see that 2020 deaths are essentially completely in line with 2015 to 2019. But then you can see that it peaks and it continues, and the US has been in a constant state of excess mortality ever since COVID started up until the end of 2020. You can see that it also completely flatlined the natural seasonality in the US. So it looks like there's almost no difference between spring and winter in the US because 2020 mortality was so high. Again, you can see the exact same thing for Peru here, for Mexico, whereas the UK, for the UK, for many, many, many countries. We are now in end of 2022. So unfortunately, many people hoped, but it did not materialize that end of 2020 would be the end of COVID. It of course wasn't. So if you look, for example, here at Cuba, like many other island countries, generally in island countries in the Caribbean and the Pacific specifically, had almost no COVID circulation in 2020, so had almost no excess deaths. You can see it may be starting in December 2020, but it's essentially you can still see the regular pattern of mortality. So there's not much going on. 2021 happens, and you can see it in Cuba, 2021. You can exactly see when COVID hit. This is, I don't remember right now if it's July or August. I think it's both. 2021 mortality essentially does what 2020 mortality did in the hardest hit areas, such as the US and Mexico. And you can also see that in a lot of countries, 2020 mortality is even higher. Right. So again, also like Paraguay and the Philippines, another good example, right? You can see in the Philippines also, it wasn't clear if there was even any excess mortality. 2021 happens, and it's clearly very, very, very visible. So a lot of the world that hasn't had significant circulation of COVID-19 2020 did experience it, unfortunately, in 2021. Now it's 2022. And here we have another sort of unfortunate but powerful example, which is Hong Kong. Where is Hong Kong? Here's Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, 2020, 2021, pretty similar to Japan over here. So not sure if there is any excess mortality or not. I think you all probably have heard of the devastating wave of COVID in Hong Kong in March, April 2022. And it is not just, a replacement of usual mortality with what you would call COVID-19 mortality, which is one of the arguments of, minimizers and deniers of COVID-19. But 2022 hits, COVID hits Hong Kong in 2022. And again, you can see the exact same pattern that you saw in Cuba for 2021, in the US and Mexico in 2020. Mortality peaks when COVID hits and causes significant excess mortality, such as the mortality in previous years is almost completely invisible. So this was just raw data. For excess mortality, we need to derive a more formal measure of expected mortality, because there's a difference between observed to expected mortality. For a World Mortality Dataset, we deployed a very parsimonious but powerful model. In econometrics, we call this a dependent variable model. We modeled the number of deaths in each week or month. This is subscript T here. And in each year, as a function of the fixed effect, which is just the mean of the weekly or monthly mortality that captures the seasonal differences that we saw earlier, and a linear trend through years and the year term. This is very, very important because it captures both the seasonal differences that we saw, right? So you usually expect deaths to be, again, higher in winter than in the spring. It also captures the changes across years due to primarily aging. So if you were to, just count the number of deaths in most countries year to year, you would see that they are increasing. But that's not excess mortality. That's just the population composition changing, population being much older from year to year, and thus you usually expect deaths to increase from year to year. After we estimate this model for each country, we're going to plug in 2020, 2021, 2022. I hope not to plug in 2023. I don't want this to continue in 2023. I think most of you don't want it to occur either, but that gives us a prediction for each point in time in each country. And the axis is simply the sum from the start of the pandemic, which we started March 2020, we start the sum. And we also estimate the variance or the standard error of our difference here. We deploy a more conservative estimate, so a higher confidence interval, because we want to avoid false positives as much as possible. So it's also the uncertainty from the coefficients, right? So we have uncertainty from the coefficients of the linear model, and you have the uncertainty in the dependent variable. This is what's called forecast variance. Every software package has a slightly different term for it. So sometimes it's prediction, sometimes it's forecast, but essentially because of this term right here, it's a more conservative estimate, so it's going to have a higher confidence interval. The bad news and the good news is that in most countries, excess mortality is really, really high, so this doesn't really matter in a sense. But again, we wanted to be as careful as possible and avoid false positives. Again, why is the trend important? I think this is a very important thing that we need to tackle in demography, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So, for example, in the US, our estimated trend, which we estimate from 2015 to 2019, means that our expected death in 2020, the absence of COVID, which is what we want, is higher by about 120,000. So excess death is lower by about 120,000. Taking the trend into account is costless, right? If there is a trend, you can measure it, you can take it into account. If there's no trend, the model will be essentially identical to the weekly and monthly mean. The trend would be very weak, would be almost zero, and you would get the exact same prediction, And the data that you need to estimate the trend is the same amount of data. So you don't need to have any external data. I'm not saying that you should, take into account hospital deaths, hospital beds per capita in the year 2010. This is external data. Its quality varies a lot. No, you need the exact same data to be able to take trend into account. Many national statistics offices, our World in Data up to September 2021, where they did a transition to our model, used just the average of deaths by week 2015 to 2019. And again, that caused, in most countries, it caused an upward biased estimate of excess mortality. So for example, it supposedly showed pretty significant excess mortality in South Korea, in Australia, and New Zealand back in start in mid 2021 when there was none. It was simply the trend from previous year, and we know that there was also almost no circulation of COVID-19. This is an example of what happens when you don't take trend or you don't take it into account well. This is work currently under review with Jonas Schuli, Dimitri Kobak, and Charles Telak, where we critique the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation estimates of excess mortality. I'm just going to take the example of Kazakhstan here, just because this, I think, an egregious example in a sense. For their estimate of access from 2020 to 2021, the red dot here is their estimate of expected mortality 2020-2021. You can see from 2000, now nowhere in the expected rising simply by 12%. I mean, in the case of Japan, it gets down by like 1%. It's nonsense in a sense, and that's, I think, also the power here and the lesson here of plotting raw data and seeing if your model makes sense. If the line makes sense. So their estimates of excess mortality, sometimes they're much lower than what they should be, according to what we think. Sometimes they're much higher. But essentially, these are all examples of not producing a sensible estimate of what deaths you would expect. It's very easy if you see 100 deaths, right? It's very easy to detect excess mortality if you say, yes, I expect 0 deaths. It's a 1,000,000% increase. You need a sensible estimate of expected. I see someone's hand is up.
Yeah,
Prabhat, yeah.
Hi, Ariel. Could you explain in a little more detail what your criticisms of the IHME estimates are in the previous slide?
Yeah, so this is deaths in 2020, 2021. These are observed deaths in all previous biannual period. The red dot, the IHME didn't give their baselines, but they said Germany has this amount of excess deaths, Japan has this amount of excess deaths, and we can just backtrack from that. We can take what their expected number of deaths is. So the red dot is the IHME's expected number of deaths. And you can see that it's completely out of trend for many, many, many countries. And these are just countries that we have data for. So we're going to leave aside countries that we don't have data for, which is, of course, an entirely different scenario and challenge. But just for the countries that we do have data for, the expected number of deaths from the IHME don't make a lot of sense. I'm not really sure why, because supposedly they are taking trend into account, but this clearly shows that something is out of whack in their model. So for example, they estimated more than 100,000 excess deaths in Japan up to the end of 2021. And that would imply that deaths in Japan would have been rising, continuously because it's a very aging country. That trend not only to stop, but to decrease. We don't think that's plausible. That's a very implausible estimate of expected deaths. So again, IHME supposedly does take trend into account. I have my theory for why what's happening in their model is just what's happening. This just as an example of what's going on here. I could have shown you estimates from Australia's National Stats Office, some estimates from Canada, which don't take trend into account the way they should. Again, trend should be taken into account. Otherwise, you're risking observing excess mortality, detecting excess mortality where essentially there is none, or it's much lower or higher than what you would be estimating. Russia is an example in the other direction. Deaths in Russia have been going on a downward trend for the past 2 or maybe even 3 decades. So even the Russian Stats Office back in 2019 had this prediction for 2020, 2021, et cetera, that the death would be on a downward trend. Not taking this into account means your excess mortality estimates are going to be lower than they should be if you're just going to take like the mean number of deaths. Okay, so back when we published the paper, I think I've mentioned this already, but the World Mortality Dataset is a live project. So we updated it 1, 2, 3 times a week. Data keeps coming out, more data for more countries. Back when we published, these are some of our conclusions. They hold still. Some of them have changed a bit in the sense of, conditions on the ground have changed. But first of all, what we wanted to see is COVID-19 causing excess mortality? Or it's just a shift from, so if in a usual year, 100 people will die and 20 people will die of the influenza, and now you said 20 people died of COVID, is it simply a change of causes of death or shift? So it's not a change in composition of causes of death. When you have significant circulation of COVID, you're going to have excess mortality. And excess and reported COVID track each other. I'm going to show you this on the chart in a few minutes. And several countries with very low circulation of COVID had no excess or even death mortality. So these Taiwan, Japan, New Zealand, you saw the example of Cuba back in 2020, Jamaica 2020. So there were a lot of countries, whether they really tried to do it by closing down borders or having travel restrictions and restrictions on movement within the country, or whether just British tourists were not going to Bermuda, whether Bermuda wanted them there or not, or in the Czech Republic, for example, before they have significant circulation of COVID, they don't have excess mortality. Another thing we found, which I think is not surprising, but a lot of the minimizers said it's got to be the other way around, that most developed or democratic countries report COVID pretty accurately. So excess mortality in COVID will be like almost on a 1-to-1 ratio. Many countries, which are not developed and or democratic, significantly underreport COVID. So in Tajikistan, for example, by now we also have data for 2021, but just annual, but up until the end of 2020, Tajikistan has reported 93 COVID deaths. Now, Tajikistan is not, an island country of 1,000 people. It's a significantly big country. I think it has like 4 million people. Excess mortality was more than 9,000. So that's a 100 ratio. Nicaragua, it's a ratio of more than 50. Uzbekistan is more than 30. If I would do it by percentage term, it would be insane. So Russia is only 460% higher. So while they reported about 200,000 deaths, excess mortality is more than 1 million, for example. And most or all excess directly attributed to COVID. That's one of our conclusions. If we drill down a little bit more, because for each country, I think I could give a whole seminar just on the experience in each country and what the data reveals. So this is just like a drill down about US up to our latest data available. You can see here again, 2015 to 2019 deaths, and the black line is our estimate for 2020. And because the US is an aging country, deaths in 2020 should be about a bit higher than what you would get from the mean. Like I said, 120,000 higher. And again, you can see the red line here, 2020 deaths up until when COVID hits, and this is here is New York and New Jersey, basically. This here is Florida. So the US has been in a constant state of excess mortality ever since March 2020. With 2021 deaths, I think, being even higher than 2020 and 2022 as well. Our estimate for expected deaths in 2022 is a bit higher than 2020, but this is still excess mortality. Here's a tracking chart. We're just going to plot our estimates of excess deaths and the reported number of COVID deaths for each of these countries. And you can see that they track incredibly well for most of these countries. Even in countries where excess deaths are much higher, for example, Mexico and South Africa, you can see that the correlation, not even just a correlation, right? It's not a correlation. It's a tracking. It's a correspondence. Is huge. So if there's a peak peak COVID wave, is going to have a peak excess mortality wave, and when COVID wanes, excess mortality is going to go almost to zero. You can also see some other things here. which I think are very useful things to do with the World Mortality Dataset as demographers. Some of them I'm doing myself. You can see here the heat wave in August 2020, right? You can see a peak in mortality in Belgium and Germany and other countries, which is completely unrelated to COVID. You can also see here the lack of influenza-like illness, or ILI, at the start of 2021. So for example, in Germany, while there was still significant reported COVID deaths, here you did have some composition effect where, because our expected number of deaths also includes, of course, deaths from all causes, including influenza, the lack of circulation of influenza meant that deaths in 2021 were lower than expected. And that's why, for example, in countries like Australia, like New Zealand, in 2020 and 2021, you had deficit deaths because you had less traffic accident deaths, you had less homicides, but these are small numbers in developed countries. What you had most of all was a lack of respiratory diseases deaths. In the paper, we do this like decomposition of what excess mortality is all about, because it's direct COVID effects, indirect COVID effects, other issues. So in our data, except for the example of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh war, and the heat waves in Europe in 2020, we believe that essentially the factor A, so deaths directly caused by COVID infections, constitute about 100% of COVID, of excess mortality. This is a bit more contentious, I think. I think some people attribute some of the excess mortality to the overburdened medical healthcare system. I don't think that's the case. We can perhaps discuss it a bit later if you want. How am I doing on time? Can someone let me know?
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay. So ever since we published this, like I said, it's a live project. The number of countries and territories has gone up from 103 to 121. We updated our baselines. So when we published it, our number of expected deaths for 2021 was the same as 2020 because we wanted to avoid, projecting 2, 3, 4 years into the future, which is more tenuous. Unfortunately, since COVID did not stop, and using the same baseline for 2020 caused some, we think, false positive detection, and consulting with a lot of demographers, some of them maybe even, in this very presentation, our term for expected mortality, which is again, what is the number of deaths you would expect in the absence of COVID, is the counterfactual. So we explicitly account for the fact that 2021 is 1 year later from 2020. So our baselines are now up to date. We have much more 2021 data for many more countries. And for some countries, we already have 2022 data, as you already saw. This figure is an up-to-date figure, but it's like the summary figure for our entire project. We derive 4 main metrics for each country that we have in our data set. We have the absolute number of excess deaths. So just, how many excess deaths. And here you can see Russia and the US at about one more by now, more than many more, like 1.2, 1.3 million excess deaths. So these are more deaths than what you would expect, but it's of course very large countries, Brazil, Mexico, Egypt. When you normalize it by population size in 2019, what you would get is that the US is no longer even in the top 10. You would get mostly very old countries, which of course makes sense because a larger share of the population is susceptible, vulnerable to something like COVID. So we'd get a slightly different ranking here. Another normalization that we do, which I think is essentially the best, perhaps the best summary metric of excess mortality, is what's now commonly known as a P-score or annual score, which is you take the number of excess deaths, you divide it by the number of expected deaths, and that implicitly accounts both for population size and for any other things that influence mortality, such as age. So an example I like to point out is Germany and Iran. Both Germany and Iran have about 84 million people. It's almost the same size country in terms of population size. Iran is much, 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 much younger. So if you get 1,000 excess deaths in Iran, it's a much higher increase than expected number of deaths than in Germany, right? And it's similar to age standardized rates. I'm a big opponent of age standardized rates because you need to settle on a standard. and the standard in Europe and the standard in the Middle East is of course completely different. So it's a mixture that I really dislike. So a P-score implicitly accounts for all of this, and there you see the tragedy that is mostly Latin America, which is very young countries, but they were hit very hard. And there have been a number of papers by now using more traditional epidemiological methods such as seroprevalence studies that in a sense say that, I'm going to butcher this, but generally speaking, a 50-year-old in a mid-income country in the middle in Latin America is essentially as vulnerable to death by COVID as a 70-year-old in a developed country, which again, to me, I think makes a lot of sense. But a lot of people used to say, Africa, Latin America, all these the Middle East, all these places where people are very young, they shouldn't worry about COVID. This sets aside the fact that even these countries have millions of 60-plus-year-old people, right? But they are not impervious to COVID. And another measure, which is what I showed you earlier, is the undercount ratio. So we take the number of excess deaths, we divide it by the number of officially reported COVID deaths. And in Tajikistan, like I said, it's more than 100. In Nicaragua, it's 50 times. In Cuba, it's I think 5.5 times higher. In Albania, 4.5. So for each 100 people they reported as dead from COVID, actual mortality is 550. These are some close-ups of some of the countries that we have. This is my neck of the woods. This is the Middle East. So Israel, Lebanon, Iran, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, all of these pretty young countries, by the way, but you can see significant excess mortality. In terms of departure from the norm, in Israel, it's probably been the lowest. You can still see the seasonality. In a lot of these countries, you cannot see the seasonality anymore because 2020, 2021 deaths were much higher. This is Africa. We have very little data from Africa because viral registration is very weak. But again, in South Africa, excess deaths are 3 times higher than reported COVID deaths. And South Africa is probably the most developed country in Africa. We also have data from Egypt, where it's 12 times higher than reported. So I think that, for the continent as a whole, excess deaths are probably somewhere between 5 to 10 times higher than reported. But due to lack of data, in a sense, it's harder to know. This is Central and Eastern Europe. The Czech Republic is an interesting example here because up until August, September 2020, there was essentially no excess mortality. And they even celebrated it on the Charles Bridge, which is a place I really like. But then when other countries stopped restricting movement and people from COVID-infected countries came into the Czech Republic, excess mortality rose significantly, and it's been very high since. You can also see here the seasonality in COVID. This is Latin America, like we discussed. These are countries, I'm giving this presentation ever since, like end of 2020. These are countries where I used to see, look, these are countries that have reported very little COVID, and they also didn't have any excess mortality. This is no longer the case, unfortunately. So we talked about Hong Kong. You can see here the exact number. So if you would expect something like 4,000 deaths in March in Hong Kong, we observed more than 12,000. This is a 4-time increase. This is very high. And up until the end of 2021, they had essentially none. Australia also, once travel restrictions went down, COVID started to spread. This is almost completely in line with reported COVID. But you can see that in 2020, for example, deaths were actually lower than what you would expect. This is the same for South Korea, Singapore, Denmark, a lot of these countries. If I take a more cumulative look, I can, just plot the cumulative number of COVID deaths and excess deaths. This is essentially what I showed you on the 4-panel plot. So this is the US. You can see the tracking between reported and COVID, but excess is being higher. This is, for example, in Canada, where some estimates of excess mortality do not take trend into account, and they believe that excess mortality is actually higher than COVID deaths by some margin or other. I think that's false. There is significant excess mortality in Canada, don't get me wrong, but excess mortality is not higher than reported. And for countries like Russia, the gap between excess mortality and reported COVID deaths is very, very high. In Taiwan, you can see that up until now, basically, right, up until a few months ago, there was essentially no excess mortality. But you can see that once COVID started to spread significantly, excess mortality is now positive, and like essentially in a 1-to-1 ratio, New Zealand still is in the negative mortality, still has a mortality deficit. Hopefully it will not increase, because New Zealand and Hong Kong, even though both countries experienced COVID in 2022 mostly, they encountered with a very different set of circumstances in terms of vaccination, for example. These are some more examples. Again, you can see here the downward shift in excess deaths because of the lack of influenza, but Germany is also on an almost 1-to-1 ratio. In Bulgaria and the Netherlands, it's higher, but it's a pretty close ratio. Some other nice examples. The data is open and available to all. This is a link to DexHub. DexHub is sort of like GitHub, but with a focus on machine learning and data. So it also has data versioning. It's completely free, and I use it a lot. You can use it just like you would use a GitHub repo. The analysis is on Dimitri's GitHub page. So the tracking figures of COVID and access and the leaderboard, and just like the number of the estimates of total excess deaths, that's on his repo. Like I said, we update about once or twice a week, so it's constantly updated. The paper is available from eLife, and I'm available by mail and also available now for any question you may have. And yeah, that's it.
Thanks so much, Ariel. We already have some comments, questions in the chat, Monica, so I'll just, get them rolling.
Yeah, no, thanks
Okay.
very much, Ariel. We have some, as Vanessa said, we've got some interesting questions in the chat. So I think the first one,
It's for
Ronak,
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to unmute yourself or we can just read it out. Is it feasible to assume that all excess deaths are directly attributable to COVID, especially in countries from sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia?
Okay, so it's not an assumption, it's a conclusion from our data. And it's true that it's maybe a bit more tenuous to think that what we have observed in the countries that we do have is also the same for the countries that we don't have. But consider the alternative. The alternative is that countries that normally register 2, 5, 10% of total deaths have reported COVID accurately. So I think the answer is there's no chance. And also we have some countries which essentially took zero precautions against COVID, such as Belarus, such as Nicaragua, where excess mortality per capita compared to what you would expect is very similar to surrounding countries. And there's no way that lockdowns or any of the other causes people thought might lead, to access being to access are non-existent. So the fact that, for example, reported cardiac arrest deaths in Nicaragua have spiked in 2020, to me suggests not that people that lockdown caused people with heart attacks to stay indoors, but that COVID, we know now, attacks like the entire system. So I think that excess deaths being almost 100% COVID deaths, I think is a very solid conclusion. And I think a very good example of that, I hadn't gone into in further details, is Peru. Peru saw that excess mortality was much higher than the reported COVID deaths, and they convened like an expert group of demographers and epidemiologists to audit their death system. And then they updated back in June 2021. So they went through their death reporting system and looked more closely at causes of death, which are probably attributable to COVID. And they increased their death toll in a day from 60,000 to 180,000, so 3 times higher, which is almost exactly the excess mortality estimates. And again, you can see that even through time, the correlation is almost 100%. So I wish more countries would follow the Peruvian example in that sense. And I think, again, most, if not all, excess mortality is COVID. There is actually a good case, I think, for the other way around. I think that excess mortality provides a lower bound on actual COVID-19 mortality, and we know it by looking at countries like France and Belgium, where excess mortality is lower than COVID mortality. And we know it because, again, our expected number of deaths takes into account all deaths that have occurred previously, and that includes traffic accident deaths, and that includes homicides, that includes influenza. since these causes in many countries, not in the US, but in many countries have went down, as mortality is actually lower than actual COVID mortality. So I think if you have 1,000 excess deaths, your COVID deaths are probably 1.2 thousand. So it could even actually be the other way around, but it's hard to wrap your head around it. It's hard for me as well. So let's just say it's about equal.
Thanks. Then there was Brian Sawyer. You want to also talk, or do you want us to read?
No, you can just go ahead and read it.
Yeah, okay. Just because brings out a really interesting point where this is also something raised in a paper where we try to indirectly estimate the infectious fatality rate, which was something a lot of people try to do. But he mentions that it seems to me that the trend in deaths is potentially just a trend in population aging. And expected deaths might be better estimated as the 2019 age, race, sex specific rate times the 2020 population. This would avoid overstating any trend in deaths. What would you react to that?
Okay, so especially when we started working on this and when we published, but also now, a lot of these countries do not report or do not reliably report deaths by age and sex. And also the population denominators. I think by now we are all acutely aware of the fact that in many countries, including developed countries, population counts by age and sex are not very good. They're pretty good, but they're not very good. So that's one of the reasons that I prefer counts to rates, because then you can, rate it by however you want. You can have whatever denominator you think is right. And also, I think that you could, if you have, deaths by age and sex, our model is internally coherent. So if you take deaths within a country and separate it out by age, sex, geographic region, whatever, the sum of your expectations would be exactly equal to the expected total, which is a very nice feature of the model, which I didn't fully appreciate until all of these modeling by age, by some subgroups have come into play. And then there's a lot of work when you use rates that you need to somehow internally cohere the estimates. So our model is explicitly coherent because of the linear terms. And also, I think, again, aging, we know that the more elderly the population, the higher the deaths would be. So you can say, okay, let's take age into account explicitly. But again, why are you taking this into account? Because you have seen in the past that the older the population is, the higher the death count is. So if you take the trend in death counts, you're essentially implicitly accounting for all of these things, including, for example, increasing life expectancy. So I think using age is possible. You could use it if you want to. You can use it. I don't think it's necessary. I think the deaths have the number of deaths. It has all this information essentially within it, and you need much less data to actually get these estimates. Something that a lot of people have done, which is a mistake, is to take our estimates of expected deaths and then standardize it by age. But again, our trend takes into account the aging population. So we're essentially doubly weighting age, and then you're going to get a biased estimate of expected deaths. And again, that's one of the reasons that we provide both the raw data and our estimates. So you could use the World Mortality Dataset as just one input in an ensemble model with many other features, but you don't have to.
Right, thanks. I guess you're speaking to a room full of demographers telling us to ignore the denominator, which I guess a lot of us probably feel kind of uncomfortable with. But I think
I
for another time.
I know it's a bit heretical to say, but you should take into account that when your denominator is uncertain, perhaps it's better not to take it into account. Like many IFR estimates will take the number of cases as reported by Belarus, right? and say, okay, the IFR is 30%. Of course, it's nonsense because the denominator is nonsense. And of course, and if even in Finland, we know that, you know, the population counts are out of whack, imagine the situation in low to medium income countries. That's why I prefer counts. But again, using counts, you can always rate it however you want. The other way around is much harder because then you need to figure out what the hell was the denominator that they used. So that's another reason why I personally prefer counts.
No, thanks. I guess I'm just gonna co-opt and ask a quick question about because you sort of mentioned data quality. And so in this data set, you've I think like it's one of the largest efforts, right? So you've got 122 countries, you said. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it mostly comes from vital registration data, which is why you're missing the large majority of Africa. But we know that there's quite substantial differences in the quality and the coverage of vital registration statistics across a whole bunch of different countries. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on, like, you know, thinking about the quality of the raw data that's going into these models. How do you sort of weigh up, you know, that aspect versus, you know, adding an additional country that may have lesser quality data and that sort of thing?
Okay, so on the World Mortality Dataset page, I also have two, I call it like sister projects of the World Mortality Dataset. One is called Local Mortality Dataset, and the other is called Preliminary Mortality Dataset. And in Preliminary Mortality Dataset, I put in some data that I obtained, which is much more incomplete in a sense than the data on the World Mortality Dataset. So, for example, I got viral registration data from Honduras, which I estimated being about 50 to 60% complete. So it's missing a lot of deaths, and I don't really know if the share of deaths registered is the same from 2015 to 2021. Then there's no issue, right? But if it has changed, it's hard to understand what is the share of access that actually coming from registration improvements or worsening. So that data I also try to put out there, but it comes with a large caveat. Most of the data on the World Mortality Dataset, I estimate that it's completed at more than 70 to 80%. But also one of the works coming from this dataset, at least on my end, is more up-to-date and recent estimates of the completeness of death registration, which from UNSD and GPD, some of them are very, very, ancient, like, from the year 2000, which is really ancient history. And I think in a sense, we were lucky that Latin America, many countries in Latin America, Brazil and Peru and other countries have underwent this transition into more modern electronic vital registration right before the pandemic. So I think in Peru, registration completeness probably improved in 2020 and 2021, but this is contentious. So not all researchers agree with me. That decreases the excess mortality estimates we have for Peru a little bit. They're still the highest in the world in a sense. So even accounting for that, you can have like bounds. But there's a different project that I have also open that I can also present in this workshop or other workshops about completeness of death registration, mostly building on this, but also other vital registration systems. So even if I had, for example, monthly data from Nigeria, I know that the completeness of vital registration in Nigeria is 5%. It's not going to be on the World Mortality Dataset because of that.
Brazil actually had a blackdown of our health registration system. I think Bernardo is here, yes, who works a lot with this coverage data. Anyway, just to say that even though we made the transition, we had a blackout just in time to not be able to do the estimates. But Frederick, you want to?
Just a little comment on the population as a denominator. I think for 2020 and 2021, it was just perfect, just perfectly fine to use the trend in that count. But as we see a pretty surprising flat trend in some Northern European countries, maybe because I suspect of smaller cohorts because of the World War II. So these cohorts were not as as populated as in other countries of the world in the last decade. So the trend is flat, and maybe as the baby boomer will reach the mortality ages, I think the projection they all show an increase in that rate in that counts in projected that counts. So maybe for 2022 and 2023, I think it will be important to use population, at least for those countries, for some countries where there is a shift in expected death count. But for bad data, where you don't have good estimates of population, most of them, I think, is their trend is pretty stable. So I think maybe we could still use the death count trend for 2023, but I think we discussed that already. I think on Twitter, and there is something we should look at.
I don't have a lot to say on this because this is hardcore demography in a sense, and I'm not. But again, I do think that because I'm putting the counts out there, if you want to have some denominator, you can do it, and it's much harder to backtrack from a rate to understand what denominator was used. So if you do want to have a rate or try to estimate a trend on rates, you could do it using our data. You just need one more step in between, and that's okay, I think.
Thank you, Ariel, and thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
thanks, Ariel. I think just because it's a few minutes after 10, so we should wrap up. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. And the data set is all open access on GitHub. So if you want to play around with it yourself and think about different methods of estimating excess mortality, you can as well. So, but thanks very much for putting this amazing resource together and coming to chat to us today. And thanks everyone for showing up, and we'll be in touch about our future meetings.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Hugo.
Bye-bye.